We are live. All right, we are live. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Community Office Hours today. Today we have the Boundary team. We have a full house. I feel like we're in full Brady Bunch view. Oh my goodness gracious. Okay. We have a whole round of folks who are here to show some awesome things happening in Boundary 0.2. But before we get started, just as a reminder, if you've joined us for community office hours before, we'd love to hear from you in the chat. Feel free to post, interact, any questions that you have, drop it in there. We'll try to answer them live. As well as if you're new to this, please be sure to keep our community guidelines in mind. Just be professional and be respectful and be welcoming. With that, I will actually pass it to the team to introduce themselves first before we get started. So starting with Pete, we'll start with Pete, and then Pete, you can pass and punt to the next person to introduce themselves.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Rosemary. I'm Pete Payson. I am responsible for product management on Boundary. Been with the team a little over a year now, and I'm really excited to talk about all of what the team has been cooking up for Boundary 0.2. I guess I will pass to Randy because you're next in my Brady Bunch screen on Zoom.
Thanks, Pete. My name is Randall Morey. I'm a front-end engineer on Boundary. I work on the UIs, such as the admin and desktop client. I'll pass it off to Jim.
Hello, my name is Jim Lambert. I am a backend engineer and an engineering lead on Boundary. And I will pass over to Jeff.
Hi there, I'm Jeff Mitchell. I'm essentially technical overseer for Boundary. I think that's probably the best title. And Randy's selling himself short because he's the engineering lead on the front end. So got a whole corp set of engineering leads here today.
And I guess that leaves me. I'm Robin Beck. I am the education engineer dedicated to Boundary. So I design and create most of the Learn content. So tutorials around that, you can blame me for those. And I also try to fiercely break everything these guys build. So.
Awesome. Okay. All right, we've got some nice reactions here. I don't know if they show up on the YouTube, but people are reacting. They're very excited. Okay. So we have a lot of content today. So Pete, could you give us a recap of what's been happening as well as a little bit of background on Boundary?
Sure. I'm actually happy to share my screen and kind of go through it a little bit because there's a whole lot that went into 0.2, and I figure it's probably best to kind of structure it and tee it up for all the demos that we're going to be doing today. So I guess for anybody that doesn't know, HashiCorp's Boundary really fits into the overall HashiCorp portfolio by focusing on human-to-machine access problems. It's really HashiCorp's answer to the question of how to securely manage access to private resource. And I imagine most people on the line have kind of had to deal with the problem of trying to grant a developer or DevOps engineer access to a set of private or production resources. Maybe that's some web service running in production or a Kubernetes cluster running in production or what name you. And they know that there's multiple levels of complexity to manage when kind of granting that access, whether that's managing the credential required for that resource, whether it's managing client permissions in a way where you don't expose too much in terms of permissions for those end resources. And then there's the whole question of providing the client a network route to that private resource in a secure way. And it's gets really nasty if that's an ephemeral resource and it's kind of short-lived. Boundary's really kind of the recognition that there's not yet an elegant open source solution to the problems in the space. I know a lot of different folks are trying and making credible kind of pursuits at solving some of these problems, and Boundary is kind of HashiCorp's answer to some of these questions. With Boundary, what we're really focused on is this whole access vision, I guess, where we're enabling identity-based access that's really suited for dynamic infrastructure. So our vision here is that users can log into Boundary, and authenticate with their identity provider of choice. From there, have kind of a granular set of identity-based authorizations that manage what systems they can access and connect to, as well as what actions they can perform on those systems. And then, have a single sign-on model to those end systems with secure just-in-time access with kind of multiple different layers of security controls, whether that's just-in-time network access granted by Boundary, or in the future dynamic credentials managed by Vault and brokered by Boundary, or even potentially the ability to introspect traffic on top of that. We'll see. And I guess since launch, kind of early indications have been that this vision has kind of landed with the community. It seems like we're kind of, folks seem to agree that this is an unmet need in open source, but like any new project, we're kind of taking our time to build out our feature set in order to fully realize this vision. Case in point being that there's parts of this that are still kind of a work in progress or just being delivered, which kind of leads us to the question of 0.2, which provides, the identity provider integrations, or at least some of them on the right side of this page. With Boundary 0.2, I guess as a whole, this really represents a pretty big milestone for the journey of Boundary. It brings a lot of incremental value in kind of our fundamental use cases, and really also focuses on meeting users' needs to adopt Boundary in a production environment. So there's a bunch of different new features available within Boundary 0.2, but a couple ones that really bear emphasis, and that also will be focused on in demos today by the folks on the call. The first is kind of our new OIDC authentication method, and that will allow users to authenticate and delegate authentication to common external identity providers like Azure AD, Auth0, Okta, as examples of ones that kind of implement the OpenID Connect specification. Beyond that, our Boundary desktop app went GA for Mac, and that offers low or no code users a way to kind of view what systems they have access to, connect to them over GUI interface, and kind of view essential session details. And then also our new worker tag and filter capabilities aren't necessarily new in 0.2, but I think warrant mentioning because this is new since our initial launch at GA of this, or of last year, I guess. And that's it. That is a huge step up in terms of Boundary's abilities to kind of grant access to private resources. Just kind of as an example of what worker tags and filters are and kind of why they're valuable. Really, the focus with that is that it allows administrators to choose which Boundary proxy workers should manage a target's connections. So that's a really critical thing for meeting users' security and latency requirements. I guess as an example, let's say, I'm based in Seattle, Washington. I have a global Boundary deployment with Boundary workers in the US, the European Union, and China, and I want to connect to, I don't know, let's say a database in this example on some private VNet in Azure's US West region. When I want to connect to that resource, I want to make sure that that connection routes through a worker that's both peered to the network that database resides on, and then also is local to that region. That way I don't need to route traffic through a worker that resides on a whole different side of the world, or risk peering through a worker that's not actually connected and peered to that private network. So in addition to these, there's a whole lot of other great new features that were available in 0.2 and the releases since our initial 0.1 release, including the ability to migrate Boundary's database to update clusters, as well as a whole set of improvements to kind of the ways in which users can list resources and navigate through them through the CLI, and in the future through our various GUI interfaces. So I think this is kind of a good primer on 0.2 and why it represents a huge step up in Boundary's ability to kind of meet key production use cases. I think Randy would be up next. Rosemary, I'm going to defer to you for who actually wants to do the first demo of these new features.
Yeah, we'll start with Randall. I did drop a note to the blog for Boundary 0.2. So if anybody's interested in a bigger summary and more detail, there's a blog there. But I'm actually pretty excited about this client authentication demo, mostly because I have been playing with the desktop app. I acknowledge this. I'm one of the people who did, and it's actually really cool. So Randall, take it away.
Sure, thank you. All right, so OIDC has been, one of the most highly requested features. It's certainly one of the key value propositions for Boundary. So we're really excited about this. It was a collaborative effort, I'd say, between design and especially backend. Special thanks to Jim Lambert for doing all the heavy lifting. I will share my screen and start with the desktop client. Hopefully everyone can see. What happens is instead of seeing a password form, which you may have seen in the past, if you have an OIDC authentication method configured, that's what you'll see in desktop. It's really just a button that says authenticate. Pretty standard. So I did a little pre-work behind the scenes to set up Okta. I created a developer account. This is a great way to test the OIDC flow. So end users will click the authenticate button and they'll pop over to their identity provider. One thing you'll notice is that the client will enter a sort of a pending state and the user can cancel or retry if they need to. I'm just gonna log in. And if I enter my password correctly, you'll land on a success page, also pretty standard. This just lets the user know that they're good, they're done, they can close the window and return to the client. So the client has detected that they are authenticated. I will do just a quick demo in the admin client as well. Pretty much the same flow here. When you go to log in, you'll see your OIDC auth method. If you have one configured, you just click on the big authenticate button. You will be taken to your provider. And same deal. You get a success screen and hopefully be redirected back into the admin since the admin client is already in the browser. So yeah, we've worked to make this as seamless and familiar as possible. I'd say the real star of the show is the CLI in the backend. So I will pass this off to, I believe Jim Lambert is next.
Yeah. Before Jim shares the screen, we actually got a question in the chat that has incited some debate. So presenting to the awesome team on here, there was a question in the chat about using this for service connections. So for example, if a local developer has a Docker container running on their laptop and that container needs access to certain APIs, is this something that would apply? Is this something that you wouldn't use? I'll start with Jeff. And then maybe if the rest of the team has some ideas or impressions, feel free to chime in.
Sure. So the debate that Rosemary mentioned was one of the people on our team suggested using console service mesh for that kind of use case, and that is a good option if you want to do as Jeff Malnick mentioned. It's Boundary is really meant primarily for user to service, not really service to service. So console service mesh is really designed for that. That said, in a sort of a kind of ephemeral development environment, you spin up a Docker container on your local laptop. That may not always be super feasible because the console service mesh relies on a console agent locally that then is configured with intentions in console to talk to other services. So you can certainly, one of the things that Boundary requires right now, which may change in the future as we kind of enable more use cases, but it does require a client that knows how to talk to a Boundary worker and begin sort of do the session authorization and then start the proxying and so on. But that is something that can be scripted. And so, the actual Boundary connect command can be run, and you can sort of have it output in JSON format, or you can have it exec a command for you that where you can put in like the IP address. It can slot in the IP address and the port or things like that. So you can actually, like in a composable way, you could actually script connections to be opened that then can be passed into other services. And one of the ways that this can be done outside of just literally running in Boundary Connect is Jeff Malnick, actually, I don't know if he has this available to share. If he does, maybe he can post it in the YouTube comment stream. But one example that he came up with was SSH using a proxy command. And so proxy command is an SSH configuration directive where you can say, when SSH is going to, when I'm run SSH, I want it to do this thing to set up the connection. And so you can set in your SSH config, you could set a proxy command. And then if you're running a script or something that needs to open up an SSH connection, then that script would automatically use the boundary command that's in that proxy command and thus automatically use boundary to connect. And so there are ways that you can slot it into that kind of workflow, especially in a kind of a developer environment. From kind of a production application environment, that's not really what we're targeting, but I do think there are use cases for like local Docker containers. So I would recommend looking into, the capabilities of Boundary Connect with the exec flag. And yeah, there's a lot of things you can do with that.
Yeah, I will admit that I might have done it just because I was playing around with stuff and I did it through the desktop app because I didn't want to do the CLI. I was just playing around with the desktop app. And it's nice to have the workflow to authenticate through the desktop app and then create like a local listener basically. And you can access the endpoints you need basically. So that's another interesting fact that I learned. Didn't know I could do that. There's actually another question that I guess we'll quickly answer before we go to the actual backend configuration of OIDC config. But the question is, do you have plans to support human access to console connect mesh endpoints through Boundary?
Pete, you want to take that or should I?
That's a very interesting suggestion. I would say that's probably not the first time that that's come up or been internally thought of. That's definitely something that I think we're thinking about long term. I don't want to get like, first rule of product management is don't give like dates or promises for things that aren't necessarily concretely in the roadmap. But certainly the idea of that is not lost on us. And that is, definitely a direction that we're interested in going. Jeff, I don't know if you want to.
I'll only supplement that with saying
maybe
that
I'm too diplomatic with that.
I'll supplement it by saying that there are some ways in which what Boundary does and what Console Service Mesh does and Console Connect overlap, and other ways in which they can be extremely complementary. And so over time, I think, just like we have integration with other HashiCorp products coming on the roadmap, I think over time, you're likely to see some integrations there.
It would be really cool though if we built some catalog that just ingested all console services maintained in the console registry. Would be neat.
Can I plus one that? Can I have that? I vote for that. I need that right now. All right. We have a slowdown in the chat. So I think we'll move to sort of the next part of the demo. It was a two-part demo for those who are just tuning in now and kind of went asynchronous. But we showed sort of the front end part of that where you're authenticating through Okta to Boundary. And I believe we're going to get a deep dive on the backend configuration. Correct, Jim?
Yeah, that's correct. So before I kind of dive into them, I just want to acknowledge a few things. The front end, Randy in particular, the back end finished up this feature way later than we anticipated, and the front end did an amazing job pulling it together so quickly so it could be part of the release. And then Robin, of course, with the documentation. I had this horrible Zoom recording of me doing, winging it on this demo for the internal team, and we had the RFC, and Robin somehow managed to turn that into a learning guide, which I'm incredibly impressed by. And then, of course, the backend team as well is much more than me. We had Mike, who was the author of the RFC, and Jeff, who's on this call, and Todd, who's not, who worked on the API and the SDK and CLI. There were over 50 PRs on a long-lived branch that lasted over 4 months. So over time, this is like 5-6 months of work accumulated over time to deliver OIDC for the backend, to do the design work, the database work, the domain work, and finally deliver the feature. So just want to acknowledge that before I get started. And with that, I'll be quiet and do a little bit of demo. Okay, so I'm running Boundary Dev here on my desktop. Nothing
Did you
fancy.
increase your font size? Sorry.
Nothing to see over there. Just Boundary Dev running over there. Let's see what this one is. This one big enough over here?
Nope. Go even bigger. Probably like 10-ish. Yeah, I think it's showing up real small on the screen.
Still too small?
Still too small, unfortunately. Might be maybe like 4 or 5 times more.
We're not going to be able to type the command pretty soon.
I know, but
I'm completely out of screen here. Yeah, let's make this like.
yeah, I think that's probably good.
Okay, so
There we go.
when you show up running Boundary as an unauthenticated user, first thing you need to do for auth methods is just find out what you can authenticate with. Go over to Boundary and say auth methods list. You'll see that you'll be able to authenticate. Those are the only things you can do when you're unauthenticated. When you list auth methods, you can see the ones that are available and that are public for you that you can actually authenticate. So from the CLI, if I wanted to go ahead and authenticate now, I could authenticate with OIDC and give it an auth method ID. And let's just grab this one right here. We'll use, so as Randy showed before, we're shipping Boundary Dev with like a built-in provider. It's nothing fancy, just something so people can get an experience of using OIDC right out of the box without having to go to Okta or Auth0 or something like that. So if you go ahead and hit authenticate there, it'll pop open a browser from the CLI. Then if you can type, you can authenticate. It says you're successfully authenticated and your token is put into the keyring. So pretty simple. And then if I went ahead and said, let's just make sure that I am authenticated as that. So let's users list. Let's see if I can list users. So I can do a little bit user stuff because I'm authenticated as the Boundary admin, right? So that's what I'm authenticated in. So I could even read myself if I wanted to. I can look at the global admin account and I can see that this account has two, this user has 2 accounts. It has a password account and it has an OIDC account. So pretty straightforward. So the next thing I'm going to show you guys is how you would go about creating a new auth method. So I'm going to create an auth method. Create an OIDC auth method. Okay, and so the first thing I probably need when I create an auth method is a client ID, something that I can identify myself when I authenticate to the provider. So I'm going to go over here to Okta. I have this little Okta thing over here. I'm going to cut and paste my ID. So I'll get a client ID. I'll get a client secret, which I'll have to rotate after this little demo because everybody on the internet gets to see what my client secret is. So that gives me my client. Now I probably need to put an issuer who's going to be the issuer for this particular thing. So I'll go over to Okta again and I'll look for the issuer, which is, they call it a domain. I got to start it with a scheme. There's my issuer. So I've got a client ID, a client secret, issuer. I know I have the reliant party information, I have the provider information. Now I need to figure out for this auth method, how will the different callbacks and stuff address the server? How will they find the server? So I'm running right now at localhost 9200. That's how you would find this Boundary instance. The last thing I need to do is pick a signing algorithm so that I can configure which signing algorithms I accept for authentication from this particular OIDC method. Boom, it's created. So when you create it, you can see a few things about it, right? You can see that, and I'll talk about these things a little bit, but it's not primary for the scope. It's not a primary auth method. Then you can see the callback URL. You're going to need this callback URL. You're going to have to take that over to the provider. There's a chicken and egg problem when you create a new OIDC method. You can't really create one that's ready to go yet because you got to go to the provider and configure a callback. So let's go do that before I forget about it, because I usually forget to do that. So we'll go over here and edit. We'll go over here and we'll go, that's not what I wanted to copy. So let's get the right thing. There you go. And you'll see that the auth method ID is actually part of that URL. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. So now at least I have the callback configured with the provider, but we're not quite ready yet to do an authentication. Because in Boundary, we have this idea of, especially for OIDC auth methods, their state, whether they're active or whether they're inactive, and there can be several different states. And we do this so that as an operator, you can configure an auth method and get it working before users start trying to authenticate and start opening support tickets on you. So right now, you'll see that this particular auth method is inactive. Right? So nobody, if somebody went back to do Boundary methods list, and let's say we'll use that, we'll say unauthenticated, they still can't see this new auth method, right? This new auth method is not available for them to see because it's inactive. They can't start to authenticate with it. So we got to make it active first. So let's do that first. Let's go Boundary auth method, change the state for OIDC, and the ID is right here. I do have to tell Boundary that I want to set the state. There we go. So now it's active private, it's available. It's still not listed when you go ahead and list it for unauthenticated users, but as an admin, I can use it to authenticate. I can go ahead and test it out and make sure that it works. But I'm still not ready to do an authentication because what we have configured now, when we look at Boundary for auth methods, and I list them, is I have these 3 auth methods, and the one I just created is not primary. So if new people authenticate, their accounts would be created, but they would have no users. They would have no Boundary user. They would have a Boundary account, but it would be associated to no user. So if I want Boundary to automatically create a user for every account in an auth method, I have to make it primary. I have to say this is the one auth method in the scope that's allowed to create these things. So if I come over here, and this is a scope activity, right? Because now I'm saying for the global scope, I want to set this as my primary auth method. So I say my ID is global, and I want to set my primary auth method. I got to say that I'm doing something too. Scopes. And then my primary auth method ID, and it's the one I just created. So now it's my primary auth method, and if I list it, it's set as the primary. So now users will be automatically created whenever a new authentication happens. So now I am finally ready to authenticate with this thing. And it brings up, because we were doing an Okta provider, it brings up my Okta. I remember my password. I've successfully authenticated. So now I've authenticated as Jim Lambert to here, but I have a lot of privileges, right? I haven't created any grants or anything for that user at all. So I can't really even do much with that user. I can't connect, I don't want to show all that at this point, but I can show you if I log in again. Go ahead and log in with the global. Log back in as admin. Now I can say Boundary users list, and I can find that account that I authenticated with before for Boundary. So we have an account that's been created and a user, and we see that from the provider, it pulls the full name and it pulls the email address. And the login name is actually the subject. So it's the OIDC subject of this particular user. And this is all this information is coming from the primary account. Remember the primary auth method we talked about before? Well, whenever you set a primary auth method in Boundary, that also determines which account will be your primary. So you could have n number of accounts associated with the user. You could have a password and a couple different OIDC accounts. But if you designate one as a primary auth method, that's where your account information will come from as well. And that's all I have right now, I believe.
Nice. Hey, Jim, can you zoom in on the Boundary logs? I think someone's interested in checking out how Boundary from a logging standpoint, shows that someone's configuring this.
Boundary doesn't show anything at this point. We do not currently have a lot of observability for Boundary. So it's something that's on our our upcoming roadmap to add observability and specific logging, more logging and more information about what's going on for Boundary for these kind of events. But for right now, it doesn't really show anything when you configure an auth method.
And I know you mentioned this chicken or egg problem. Can you configure an auth method like this in the Terraform provider for Boundary?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of a chicken and egg problem, and it's an OIDC problem, right? OIDC, because you need to configure the callback with a provider as a resource in Terraform, can't really create a complete resource that's ready to go, right? I mean, it's going to be more than one API call. You're going to have to create the resource, and then you're going to have to do another operation to change its state to make it active or inactive or something like that if you want people to authenticate. And so the Terraform provider, which is not quite ready, I think it's getting pretty close. I think Jeff Mitchell might be working on it, or the Jeffs together might be working on that. But I think what they've decided to do is to make that creating that resource 2 API calls. So there'll be an API call to create the resource, and then another API call to set its state to active or inactive or whatever you decide to set the state on the particular resource in Terraform. So yeah, it's an interesting problem, and it's an OIDC problem. Like the spec is kind of designed this way where you have to configure a callback with a provider, but for Boundary, you have to create the auth method before you know what the callback is.
I posted a link in chat to the PR that's available if you want to check it out. I know there's what is the dev OIDC auth method exactly?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what we did for Boundary is we wrote a open source library called, I think it's called CAP right now. That might change. It's not the best name in the world, but we wrote an open source library that had a test provider in it. And we wrote that test provider initially just for testing for unit tests. And then when we started to work on Boundaries feature, we decided to go ahead and make some changes to that and allow that test IDP to be embedded into Boundary. So it runs on a separate listener, and it acts and quacks and walks like a OIDC provider. So that's what it is. And it has very limited capability. It's really just for Boundary dev. It's just in there so that you can see OIDC and experience OIDC with Boundary dev and get a flavor for it. It's not ever going to be something, I can't ever imagine that it'll ever be something that's a real OIDC provider.
But you can use it for things like, changing state, like basically testing out the workflows. And it's pre-set up. The other thing to mention, it's pre-set up with accounts that match the ones that are pre-set up in the dev password auth method. So not only is it the same usernames and passwords, but it maps to the same users. There's separate accounts mapped to the same user. And so it also is a good way to show like how users can be mapped to multiple accounts and have those grants carry over regardless of how they log in. The other thing I'll mention is we did a lot of testing with Okta. We've also tested with like Azure Active Directory, and so it should be pretty robust across various OIDC providers.
Awesome. All right, so I posted a link to CAP, name subject to change, in the chat. I apologize. For some reason, they keep deleting my links. I'll repost them if they delete. We're going to figure it out. Some technical difficulties on our end. There is another question in the chat that is asking about boundary stickers. I don't actually know when we're going to have boundary stickers available, but I'll bring that back to our team to see if we can generate some. I don't know if the team already has boundary stickers or not, but we'll figure it out.
I don't think we have stickers yet available, but one like shameless plug is that on the boundaryproject.io homepage, there's a survey that users can take if they've tried out Boundary and want to provide some feedback. That's a way to enter yourself to get some Boundary swag. So shameless plug there. Also, one other topic, kind of building off what Jeff said about the different OIDC providers that we've tested on. Robin, kudos to him for coming up with the OIDC Learn Guide. That actually has examples both for Okta and Auth0 built in, and then we've got an upcoming one for Azure AD also as an example for that Learn Guide. And those are just three examples we provide. Any OIDC provider should work with this authentication method.
Awesome. All right, we're going to keep rolling along. I think there's a lull in the chat. Robin, you have something, you have a demo, I believe, about target worker filtering, which he mentioned this was something we briefly talked about before, but wasn't something we actually showed to a great extent. And I believe you built a tutorial around it.
The tutorial is forthcoming. Hopefully later this week / early next week, it'll be live. So you'll get a chance to experience this on your own. In the meantime, definitely check out OIDC Auth. You get to experience the chicken and the egg problem yourself, which is informative. But yeah, I'll hop over here now to my demo environment. Can you see this diagram I got pulled up?
You may need to zoom in on it.
Zoom in. Oh, really?
Yeah, 2 or 3. There you go. Yep. That's great.
Right.
Yep.
Great.
Thank you.
But yeah, you'll get the opportunity to try this yourself as well pretty soon. So yeah, just a little bit about target aware workers. What is this, right? It's really this ability to kind of specify filters against worker tags to control which workers are allowed to handle a target's session. And so this allows you to essentially tie workers to a given target and forces a session to occur through a specified worker. And this is really important for Boundary to be a really key player in multi-region cloud environments where you might want to have like a single set of controllers living in one region and then have workers in several regions where they can proxy requests to specific targets that like to hang out on a specific network slice. So that's kind of the point of target aware workers here. And additionally, kind of here's a little preview of the environment that you'll get to try out on the tutorial that's kind of forthcoming. We use Docker to spin up a little Boundary cluster. It's got a single controller and 2 separate workers inside of it, and they are isolated onto their networks with several targets that you can make requests to. So this is kind of just a overview of what that environment looks like. And let's see here, I've already got this environment kind of up and running. The important part here, hope you can see my text size here. Let me know, I can make it bigger if need be.
Yeah, it's gonna be 2 or 3 times.
2 or 3 times, all right.
I know, okay, that's probably good. Yeah.
Can't get more granular, sorry. So maybe
fine.
I'll just show these individual files one at a time. How about that? Great. So essentially, here's the compose environment. It's got several different. It's got databases for Boundary, the controller, a couple different workers, and then several different targets that have been defined that live on those networks. The important part here is the different worker configurations that are deployed here. If I step through, for example, the worker 1 configuration that I have put together, this has a specific name that we associate with this worker. This could be anything. Regions are a common way to specify what workers exist where. And then we can have arbitrary tags assigned to a worker. So this might be the region where you want that worker to live. It could be for production or dev environments. It could be, in this example here, I've decided to provide several different tags for, say, this is a database-based worker. It's also going to handle all my Postgres targets. So you can set up these tags to be what you want, and then associate your various targets with them. So what I have here is one worker, I have a second worker, and they both have these various different tags associated with them depending on their name and just what you want to do. After you've got that defined, you can go ahead and establish what targets should be associated with these workers. And you can do that in a couple different ways. The most kind of straightforward way, we'll just use one terminal session here. Sorry about that. Is you can go ahead and update the worker itself by running, I believe it's boundary targets update. Yeah, I think I've got this all queued up here. So let's say I wanted to update a particular target to go ahead and be associated with one of those workers that I've defined. So I've already grabbed the target ID here. This is for Postgres. I guess before I get started here, I could list, use this fancy new recursive listing thing and show you the different targets that are available. Here's the Postgres instance that I have set up. Here's a MySQL target and also a Redis target we have available. For the Postgres one, I can grab its ID and then go ahead and again ask for boundary targets update. Looks like it matches there. And you'll notice there I have this worker-filter attribute where I can assign this regular expression that associates a particular filter with this target. You can see that listed above here, where for the Postgres target, I have this guy. So you could go through and define this for all of your targets if you'd like. And the point of this being at this time, now I can go ahead and say, boundary connect Postgres. I can apply that target name, the scope it lives in, and I can run a command here like list the available databases. When I run this, it'll ask for my Postgres password, and there's a list of the databases that are associated with that target. If I were to go through and update the filter, for example, and set it to a non-existent worker, like worker 3, you would see that the worker filter updates, but when I attempt to connect, no workers are available to handle the session or all have been filtered. So there's kind of a brief overview of how target-aware worker filtering goes. This is a great way to go ahead and set it up directly, but I also highly recommend checking out how this works inside of the Terraform provider. If I were to scroll down through how these different targets are configured. Let's see when I get to the targets themselves. Postgres. Yeah, so here's an example of setting up that filter. In general, this is what the filter might look like. If it was more complex, I could specify, I want workers that have a name of worker 1 or are associated with prod in their tag type or database in their tag type. Because you're in the Terraform provider, you do have to do a little bit of escaping syntax with HCL, so it ends up looking a little bit uglier. But you can essentially just rerun your Terraform provider, and it will update the worker, the targets to be associated with the new worker. And this is how I kind of prefer to play with this environment. Let's see, I think that's essentially all I have to show you here. I guess the last thing I could demonstrate is that this is all available inside of the Boundary desktop app. I don't think we really have to go through this except to really rep the app a little more. I'll sign into the primary with my super secret password. If I were to go ahead and say the MySQL target, I could establish a session here. I could grab this port 61465. Whoops. That would be to directly establish it. But if I wanted to just say MySQL, I could then provide that port that I just copied, assuming it hasn't timed out already. And bummer, the demo gods are failing me.
It's fine. We went through, 2 people, 2 out of 3 bad. And honestly, it was like mostly 80% anyway. So we're good.
And you can see that it's not showing off quite what I wanted it to, but it's getting that communication packet error. I'm not sure what I did wrong here. Oh, I know what I did wrong. Yeah, the host, I think, needs to be provided first. You can see there's a timeout that occurs if I don't establish a session quickly enough. So that's why I'm coming back and pressing connect again. And yeah, we'll just stop here.
Good way to highlight, though, that all sessions in Boundary have some TTL attached to them that's administrator defined. Only gotcha is if you set it too small, then it's not necessarily fast enough for a user to actually create sessions often.
Exactly, and you can kind of have a little bit of fun here. You can see that all my workers are being filtered for Postgres. So kind of fun how that works. All right.
Awesome. Thank you, Robin. And apologies for everybody as we are just trying to figure out some technical difficulties. Anyway, we have a question in the chat. Someone asked if there is a native Vault integration as an identity provider.
So I don't. Maybe Jeff knows a little bit more about whether or not Vault has already talked about this.
I do know more about it.
Okay. Well, yeah, because I don't know what we're allowed to talk about. But Jeff,
what I can say is, so Vault has for a while had the ability to generate OIDC tokens for in kind of a manual fashion. Like you can go to it and say, give me an OIDC token based on your Vault identity information. And so that's something that Vault has supported for a while. I can't give any specific time estimates or something because I honestly don't know what they are. But I do know that there is work ongoing to allow Vault to handle the actual round trip so that if you have auth methods configured in Vault, especially if you have like plugin based auth methods with custom plugins, but basically you'd be able to use Vault as that OIDC provider. Again, I know that work is ongoing. I don't know anything else in terms of, is that open source or enterprise. I don't know when it is slated to come out. So I'm not being coy on purpose. I just don't know offhand. But I do know that work is happening.
And the advantage there is that you could use Vault as like an OIDC bridge, a la something like Dex.
Right. So Vault, exactly. So Vault has a number of authentication methods, and if you're already set up in Vault and you have authentication methods, providing identity and all that kind of stuff, then you can easily sort of, you can say, okay, well, can I just use my preset auth method? So let's say LDAP, for instance, and this is actually, doing this kind of acting as a sort of bridge for Boundary and other products is one of the reasons that the Vault team is working on this. And so, for instance, like through, if you're using Vault already and you want to use Boundary, but you need to use LDAP, you could say, oh, I already have LDAP set up in Vault, and now I can point Boundary at Vault as my OEDC provider. And then when I am directed to Vault, I can log in via LDAP and then come back. And so that's the general idea, and that's the motivation for it. It's happening. I just can't give more info on that because I don't know it.
All right. Awesome. So I guess we have 9 minutes left. And there's a question, I guess, that I have, which is what should we be expecting in Boundary 0.3? Is there anything new in terms of reference architectures, features?
So there's actually the team's cooking up a lot for 0.3. There's a couple of different kind of key areas that we'll be focused on. The first, which is in our roadmap, publicly available on the Boundary project.io website, is just the need to kind of start to address the need of secrets management for target connections. So right now within Boundary, if you execute a Boundary connect, you create a secure TCP tunnel to that end target, but when you actually go to access that resource, you generally need to provide some credential, whether that's an SSH cred or, database cred or what have you. We're going to look at kind of starting to solve that problem on Boundary so that we can securely manage secrets on behalf of end users. Lucky for us, HashiCorp has a really good solution for that problem. So maybe some integration will be at play with that. We'll see. But we can, everybody can expect something along those lines to come out with 0.3. Another kind of key one, and it was asked in the chat earlier, was just around making our observability, metrics and logs richer for production usage. That's going to kind of be an ongoing thread within Boundary, but that's going to be an area where we invest pretty significantly for 0.3 and kind of put a first stake in the ground in that area. Those are probably going to be the two biggest areas that you can see. There's a whole lot of additional front end capabilities that will be peppered in there. I know one actually, there's going to be a couple of things that might even land within front end before 0.3, but I don't know necessarily how much I want to disclose on that, but it's kind of like a grab bag of things that'll be worked on between like OIDC, CRUD operations, and the admin UI. There's been kind of longstanding requests for expanding our Boundary desktop app beyond just Mac OS. So we might see that over the next month or two. We'll see on that front. And I think that's probably it for top of mind for 0.3 for things that I really feel safe about shooting my mouth off on. If anybody else has anything they want to add, feel free.
I'll just add that I think that there are always the things that we are specifically planning on, and then there are things that we are not necessarily planning on ahead of time. There are many other things that we are thinking about which will appear when they're ready, and so there will likely be many other things that appear before 0.3 that aren't the specific kind of tentpole features that Pete's talking about. Just as was the case with the 0.1 series.
For all worker tags, for example, that landed in 0.15.
Yeah, worker tags, recursive listing, showing available actions on resources and listing, lots of different kinds of did I say list filtering? So lots of different kinds of things that appear that are really designed to kind of make the overall experience better, especially. That's one of the things we've been really focused on, because while the project is so early, we still have an opportunity to sort of make some fundamental changes if we realize that, from kind of the early feedback and our own sort of experience using the product more, if we realize that those are necessary. And so, I think we've already made a lot of enhancements to sort of the operator workflow and the admin workflow and sort of the user experience, outside of just, adding specific support for these features. So we've done that a lot in 0.1, and I think we'll probably have more of that coming in the 0.2 series. It becomes much harder to break things later when people are sort of in production.
Right. And then one last thing I would add is if it's not in that kind of grab bag for 0.3, does certainly not mean that it's not kind of in the overall vision for Boundary or something that we'll be working on throughout the year. We've got a whole roadmap lined up for releases beyond just that.
Alrighty, I think the chat is winding down, so we're going to close out for today. Is there anything else that anybody would like to feature? I know our links are a little strange, so I'm going to try to aggregate them and put them in a post and discuss. So we've shared the OIDC Learn tutorial. We tried to post the desktop app tutorial, except somehow Google moderation appears to be eating the link for, I don't know where it's going. And then there's a new GCP reference architecture link as well, and I'll be sure to put that on a post and discuss, as well as a link to this particular office hours. In terms of other events, if those are anybody who's interested in other community office hours, I believe there's some tomorrow for Terraform Thursday. Definitely check it out. And there's going to be one for Console next week as well. So definitely tune in again. We appreciate everybody from the Boundary team who is here and who is available to us and patiently answered questions as well as showed a whole amazing set of features. And with that in mind, thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you at the next community office hours.
Thanks, folks.